Hello. So today we're going to be taking a look at the takeoff and climb phases of flight. So before we get into the takeoff, I'm actually going to cover a couple of things that we can do during the taxi. So the first things that I'm going to talk about is actually a little bit of taxi technique. So what I've found is that if you're taxiing along a taxiway and you have the centre line of the taxiway here pass just to the left hand side of the fire warning light here, that should pretty much put your nose wheel bang onto the centre line. So if I just skip to an outside view just now, you can see there that the nose wheel is perfectly centered on the center line there, and the aircraft, as you know, as a result, is perfectly centered on the taxiway there. So just a little bit of a taxiing tip there. Just have the line passing just to the left of the fire warning light, and that should do you good. Now, PMDG's documentation also recommends that you run the engines for at least 2 minutes during your taxi to make sure that it gives enough time for the engines to warm up, and more importantly gives time for the oil pressure and the oil temperature to warm up and stabilize there. So we've been taxiing for more than 2 minutes, so that's not going to be a worry there. Okay, so during our taxi towards the departure runway, what we can do is we can now turn on the weather radar. So we can do that by coming up to the EFIS control panel here and just tapping on the WXR button. Now, we're not going to see any returns on the weather radar in this video because I am flying with the fair weather preset. However, if you had heavy clouds or rain in the sky, then you would most likely see some weather radar returns there. What you can also do is if you're flying in mountainous terrain, you can also turn on the terrain radar as well. You can do that by tapping on the TERR button here, again on the EFIS panel. Now, because we're flying in England, it's relatively flat, but you can see some returns are popping up there. However, it's not a major concern, so we're just going to leave that on the weather radar there. So now that we've done those two actions, now we need to do the Before Takeoff Checklist, and it's very simple. There's only two things that we need to check. First, we need to have a look over at the flaps setting. We just want to make sure that the flaps are in the correct setting for takeoff, so they were flaps 5 there. If we just double check our CDU, we had flaps 5 programmed in for takeoff, so that's all correct. We also want to make sure that we have this green LE flaps extended light here, just to show that the leading edge devices on each wing are extended and are in the correct position. And then finally, we want to check the trim setting. So if we have a look at the CDU again, our trim value that we needed was going to be 5.02. If we have a look at the trim wheel there, the little tooltip tells us 5.03. Again, the trim setting doesn't have to be absolutely perfect and exact for takeoff. As long as you're within maybe 0.05 units of trim, then you should be okay. After you do lift off and start climbing away from the runway, what you can do is employ trimming technique just to trim out the pitch of the aircraft, just to make it a bit easier to control as well. And that's something that you're going to hear me doing after I take off, is you're going to hear the trim wheel spinning, and that's just going to be me manually trimming the aircraft just to make it a bit easier to control the pitch angle during the takeoff before we hand over control to the autopilot. So that's everything we need to do before we reach the runway. So what we're going to do just now is cut the video here, and we'll rejoin when we're just short of the runway. Okay, and here we are at the runway holding point, so I'm just going to bring the aircraft gently to a stop. Just there. So now that we're going to be stopping, I'm just going to also enable the parking brake there, just to keep the aircraft in position, make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, so now that we're holding short of the runway, now would be the time to contact air traffic control and ask them for takeoff clearance. So generally, air traffic control will ask you to enter the runway but hold position, or they will just give you takeoff clearance to take off straight away. For this video, let's imagine that air traffic control have asked us to enter the runway but hold position. So what I'm going to do is, now that we've been given clearance to enter the runway, I'm going to turn on the strobe lights. So if I come over here to the position lights, we want to move the position lights up to the strobe and steady position there. And also, now that we're going to enter the runway, now we can turn our transponder on. So we're just going to move that all the way to TARA, the far right option there. So that's going to activate the traffic avoidance systems there, the TCAS system as well, traffic collision and avoidance system. So just release the parking brake there, just apply a bit of power. Now when you're moving around on the runway, you need to maybe use a bit more power. Air traffic control would like you as a pilot if you don't really dilly-dally on runways, so to speak. So I'm just going to apply quite a bit of power there just to get us rolling forward a bit quickly, and then reduce it there just so we can get into position nice and quickly for air traffic control and not really mess their day up by delaying anyone behind us. So we're just going to roll onto the runway, and I'm going to use that same taxi technique. Try and get the center line lined up just to the left of the fire warning light there. Just to get ourselves lined up bang on the center line of the runway there. Like so. Now we might need to slightly adjust the taxi on the way. But that's fine there. So I'm just going to enable the parking brake again because I'm not going to take off. I'm actually want to talk about the takeoff procedure before we get started. So now that we've lined up, the first thing that we can do is turn on the fixed landing lights there, only the fixed landing lights. And I generally do that once I'm lined up along the runway. I don't turn them on as I'm entering the runway. I do that once I'm lined up. I'm pointing down the runway there. So let's talk about the takeoff because there's going to be a lot happening and it's all going to happen too quickly for me to try and explain it during the procedure. So let's cover it first so you understand what's going to happen during the takeoff, and then I can kind of talk about it in a concise manner as we are actually taking off. So the first thing I'm going to do is set the thrust manually to about 40% on the N1 gauges here. We're going to keep an eye on the engine readouts there, make sure that everything is equal, make sure that everything is within limits, and then what we're going to do is push a toga switch to put the aircraft into its takeoff go-around mode. What that will do is that will give us some pitch indications here on the flight director, just to enable the aircraft to climb its most effective rate away from the runway. Now in real life, pilots would enable toga by pushing one of these buttons here on the throttle, on the forward thrust levers here. However, for us simmers, it's a bit tricky to have to look down, press a small button, and then look back up at where we're going. So what PMDG have done is they've actually put in a hidden toga button just to the left of the flight director switch here. If you watch my mouse as I move my cursor over this area just to the left of the flight director switch, you can see that it gives the little kind of finger pointing cursor there. So what I'm going to do is, once I'm happy that the engines are stable at 40%, I'm going to click this area just to the left here, and that will put the aircraft into its toga mode. What we should see on our flight mode annunciator is we should see the aircraft go into N1 on the auto throttle system column here, and we'll also see toga in the pitch control column here as well. Once we've confirmed that the aircraft has gone into its toga modes there, we also want to keep an eye on, or just have a glance over here at the N1 again, and make sure that the engines have accelerated to the N1 bugs here. So it'll be 91.7 on both engines. We want to make sure that the engines have accelerated up to that speed and not gone above or below it. Now, once we're rolling down the runway, what pilots would do in real life is call out 80 knots. And the reason that they do that is because it's just a cross-check between the pilot's flight displays here. They just want to make sure that their flight displays are still synchronized. And as the aircraft is passing 80 knots, the captain and the co-pilot would just confirm that their speed readings are equal on both sides. Beyond that, the next call out is going to be the V1 speed and then the V rotate speed. Now for this flight, the V1 and the V rotate speeds are the same, 134 knots, so the two call outs are going to come pretty much one after the other. Once we hit the rotate speed, what I'm going to do is pull back gently on the stick and then just let the aircraft slowly raise its nose and just gently lift off the runway. You know, we're not doing a high performance fighter jet takeoff in this aircraft, so you don't need to yank the controls back and get the aircraft off the runway quickly. You know, just pull back, let the nose rise slowly, and then the aircraft will just gently lift off the runway very easily and very effortlessly. And then once we've confirmed that the aircraft is climbing at a safe rate, then of course we would raise the landing gear and lift the landing gear and pull the wheels up and fold them away. Now as we're climbing away from the runway, what we want to do is just again trim the aircraft just to make controlling the aircraft a bit easier. So you might hear the trim wheel spinning, and that will just be me making it easier to control the pitch of the aircraft. And then once we pass 400 feet on the radial altimeter, and we can check that by having this, looking at this number at the bottom of the attitude indicator there. Once we pass 400 feet, we just want to confirm that the LNAV and VNAV buttons are lit up. If they didn't light up in the previous video, or if they didn't light up as you were pushing back or just getting the aircraft ready before the engine start procedure, once we've passed 400 feet radio altitude, the buttons will now be active, so you just click both of those to arm them, and then after that we're going to click Command A, so this top left button here, to enable the autopilot and then get the aircraft flying itself. Okay, and then once all of that's done, then we'll be looking at some after takeoff check items. So let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is bring the engines up to 40% N1, and I'm going to try and talk through this as best as I can. So adjust the view there, so I've got a good view of the runway and my instruments. Probably that'll be a bit better there. So manually set up to 40 on the N1 there. Release the parking brake, of course, that would help. So the engines are all equal, everything is within limits, that's happy there. So toga mode, N1, toga, engines are accelerating up to 91.7. So looking down the far end of the runway, do a little bit of steering there to make sure I keep myself centered. So looking at the speed now, we're at 70 knots, 80 knots, we would confirm that if we had a co-pilot. So you can see some green bugs on the speed tape there, those are my V1 and V rotate speeds. V1, we're going to gently pull back and just let the aircraft lift up into the air. So now following the flight director for pitch angle. So we're climbing, landing gear comes up just by pressing G on your keyboard. So I'm just following the flight director, trimming the aircraft there. So we're now at 600 feet radio altitude, so check VNAV, LNAV is lit up, Command A. We've got command there on the primary flight display. So the aircraft is now flying itself. So now next thing that's going to happen is we're going to reach our acceleration altitude. So you can see now that the aircraft is pitching down, and what it's going to do is start gaining speed. So what we're going to watch for is once the aircraft passes this number 1 bug on the speed tape, we're going to retract the flaps all the way. So we're passing 1 now, so bring the flaps up all the way up to the up position. And you can see that the auto flight system has set the speed to 230 knots. Once the flaps are fully retracted, you will see that we lose the overspeed warning there, and the speed will automatically adjust to 250 knots. Like so. Perfect. So the aircraft will now accelerate to 250 knots, which of course is the speed limit below 10,000 feet. And now we're just going to follow the departure route as we programmed it earlier on in the before flight procedures. So now that we've taken off and the autopilot is working, now we can do some after takeoff checks. So first thing we can check is that the taxi light is off. Let's turn that off there. If you were using the runway turn-offs, you could turn those off as well. Next we turn the auto brake off. Next we move the landing gear lever into its central off position. So to do that, just left click once on the landing gear lever, and that just depressurizes the hydraulic systems controlling the landing gear. Next, if the weather is good, we can now turn the engine start switches from continuous to off. Of course, if you have the other ignition system, just leave them in the auto position there. And then finally, we can set the CDU here to the legs page, so that gives us more detail about each waypoint along the departure there. Okay, so once we've done all of those steps, now we can check through or run through the After Takeoff Checklist, which you can find on QRH, and I believe it's page 25, you can find it on there. So the first thing we want to check is the engine bleeds. So we just want to come over here to the air conditioning panel, make sure the 2 engine bleed switches are in the on position there. We want to check the pack switches, make sure they are in the auto position there. Come back and have a look at the landing gear, make sure that's in the up position there, so the lights are off, and we also want to make sure that the lever is in the off position there. And then finally we want to make sure that the flaps are up which they are there as indicated, and again that we have no lights on the leading edge systems there. Okay, and that's the takeoff done. So now we're going to run through the climb procedure. So what the aircraft's going to do just now is obviously follow the departure procedure that we programmed into it. Now the steps that we need to do during the climb are actually not that complex. There's only a couple of things that we really need to look out for. Obviously, if you're flying with air traffic control, you want to be listening out for any air traffic control instructions. They may be vectoring you manually during your departure, so listen out for that if they are. For this flight, we're just following the departure procedure. We don't have air traffic control, so it's not something we need to worry about. So if you're flying in the UK or most other places in the world, you need to watch out for when you have climbed above the transition altitude. Obviously, once you've climbed above the transition altitude, then you would need to set the barometric pressure to its standard setting there, and that's very easily done just by clicking the standard button here on the EFIS control panel. If you're flying in the United States, the transition level is much higher, at 18,000 feet, so you may need to just reorder the steps. Obviously just reorder the steps that are on the screen just now, just to for whichever way makes sense to you. Once we've climbed above 10,000 feet, we can turn the fixed landing lights off, so we'll do that in a few minutes time. And also, again, once we've climbed above 10,000 feet, that would be a good kind of time to turn off the passenger seatbelt signs there. So we're just about to make a left-hand turn just now to start heading towards the Lambourne waypoint there. So you can see we're just approaching the Det 10 waypoint there. We've now hit that waypoint, so the aircraft is now turning. So what's going to happen here is we're going to reach the Lam 10, the Lam 15 waypoint. That's where we're flying to just now, and you can see that we've got a speed limit of 250 knots here, /5000. So we're going to be reaching this waypoint at 250 knots at 5,000 feet. And you can see the waypoint after that is 250 knots at flight level 060. So what we've got here is speed /altitude there. So, and I'm actually going to do something. After we climb to 6,000 feet as well, just in case you are flying with air traffic control and they give you a new altitude restriction, or they give you a new altitude clearance. I'll talk about that in a moment, but for now you can see that we're stuck at 5,000 feet there. If we have a look at the altitude tape, 5,000 feet, that's correct. However, we do have 6,000 programmed into the MCP. So what we've basically told the aircraft is that you can climb up to 6,000 feet, but at the moment we are restricted by the departure procedure there. As I said, I will change that in a moment. If you are flying with air traffic control, for example. Also, another good habit to get into is to change the heading selected here to match what the aircraft is currently doing. Now, because we're flying in LNAV mode, the aircraft is not going to sort of listen to what you tell it to do. All you're basically doing is just changing the heading bug there, just to match up your current heading. It's just a good habit to get into when you're flying with LNAV. So we're just approaching the Lam 15 waypoint just now, and you can see Lam 10, we're going to climb up to 6,000 feet. So what the aircraft is going to do, once we pass the Lam 15 waypoint, is the aircraft is going to change some of its throttle and vertical speed modes here, and it's going to automatically climb up to 6,000 feet. So it's going to do a pretty short, quick climb up to 6,000 feet. So it's kind of agreeing with the restrictions here, which have been programmed into the CDU. So you can see we've got N1 and VNAV speed. You can see the aircraft is starting to climb. If you have a look outside as well, you'll see the nose pitch up. Get a little audible warning there, just telling us that we're now within 1,000 feet of our selected altitude there of 6,000 feet. And as we approach 6,000 feet, the aircraft then levels off, reduces the speed of the engines, just to maintain speed there and maintain altitude. Okay, so the next waypoint after LAM 10 is going to be the main Lamborn VOR. Now, let's imagine that we're flying with air traffic control, and let's imagine that air traffic control have now said, okay, you're now cleared to your cruising altitude, flight level 360. How are we going to manage that? Well, all we do is we simply dial the altitude up to what air traffic control have given us clearance for. So rather than being stuck down at 6,000 feet for the entire departure procedure, we're going to be able to start our climb a little early here. So we set the altitude to flight level 360, 36,000 feet. And you can see here now that we have LAM, we should be reaching the LAM waypoint at 6,000 feet. But what we're going to do is once you've changed the altitude there, you can hit the altitude intervention button. What that's going to do is cancel. Actually, if I pop that out there so I can get that on the screen, it'll be a bit easier to see what's going on here. So if we go up and tap the altitude intervention button here, what that does is that cancels the first altitude restriction that we had there, and you can see now that the aircraft, get rid of that there, again has gone into its kind of climb modes there, N1 and VNAV speed, and the aircraft is now going to start climbing up to the altitude that we've set it to, so flight level 360. Now, if you had another waypoint which had another flight restriction there, it would still adhere to that altitude restriction. It's only because Lamborn was the last waypoint which had an altitude restriction that the aircraft is now going to climb all the way up to flight level 360. However, if we'd done that one waypoint earlier, then we would have had to press the altitude intervention button twice to cancel two altitude restrictions here from two waypoints. Okay, so now that we're climbing very quickly now, 3,700 feet per minute, you can see here that we've got a yellow indication on the barometric pressure. So what that's telling us is that we now need to set that to standard. So I'm just going to go up here to the EFIS panel, press the standard button there. Because we're above the transition altitude, we can now use standard pressure. We've now just passed 10,000 feet as well, so we're going to go back to those couple of steps that I talked about earlier. We're going to turn off the fixed landing lights. And what I like to do, as during the climb and cruise and descent phases of flights, is I like to set the fasten seatbelt signs to auto rather than off. Okay, so now also at this point, now would be a good time to just increase the range on your nav display there, just so you can see a bit more of the route ahead of you. If we have a look here, you see that we've got this green TC here, which represents the top of climb. And yeah, now the aircraft is pretty much going to fly itself all the way up to Scotland. So that's pretty much everything that I want to cover in this video here. So in the next video, we're going to be looking, at a couple of things that we need to do during the cruise before we start descending. And then I think for the next video, we're going to look at the whole descent, approach and landing. So if you want to see that, keep an eye on this channel and you'll see that video very soon. So until then, thank you all very much for watching. Take care out there, and I will catch you all later.